have noticed that many things the government does, even with good intentions, ends up backfiring. They don't work the way that they were intended to. And if a private organization makes a mistake and does badly, it will lose money and it will go out of business. But with government, it's different. If the government does badly and makes bad mistakes, it will be expanded rather than taken away. They'll say it's because it's not enough resources that they were given, or they'll set up a new agency to do what they were supposed to do in the first place. As in the Federal Reserve System, which was established in 1914 for the purpose of preventing things like the Great Depression, and yet its existence was responsible for the depth of that very depression. The Federal Reserve System was established to prevent bank runs and bank failures that happened during the Great Depression, but they made it worse, much worse, by not doing what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to provide liquidity, but they ended up instead reducing liquidity. And the quantity of money in the United States fell by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. The Federal Reserve System at all times during that period had the power to prevent that decline, and it was established for the purpose of preventing this from happening, but it didn't do it. And so what happened? The Federal Reserve System wasn't abolished, unfortunately, but instead the Federal Deposit Insurance was created to do what the Federal Reserve was supposed to do in the first place. This is an example of how it works with government programs and why we are in such trouble right now with the Federal Reserve and their practices of quantitative easing. So what does quantitative easing, or QE, really mean? It really means debt monetization. That's when a central bank like the Federal Reserve prints up money and buys government federal bonds. So they put new money into circulation. They're inflating the money supply, and that's the very essence of inflation. Whenever the central bank says that we're doing QE, what they actually mean is that they're causing inflation. And that's what they did. And the consequences of that is that we're all paying higher prices. So if we want to get rid of inflation, they have to shrink that money supply. So they have to do the opposite of easing, which is quantitative tightening. They've got to sell US government bonds and then take that money that they get and destroy it so that the money supply goes down. The problem is, who's going to buy all these government bonds? Because up until recently, the Federal Reserve was the biggest customer of the US government, because the Federal Reserve was the biggest buyer of treasuries, helping to finance the deficit. So when the Fed goes from being the Treasury's biggest customer to their biggest competitor, competing with the government to sell these treasuries into the market, who's going to buy all these treasuries, and where is the money going to come from? The answer is nobody's going to buy them. The price will collapse, which is why interest rates are rising every single day. And it's the highest rates we've had since COVID, and it's going up every day because nobody wants to buy treasuries. So every day, more and more treasuries get sold. Rates are going to keep on going up until eventually the markets crash and the Fed has to pivot and force its stance to change and say, oh, we can't hike rates anymore and shrink our balance sheet. And that's when inflation is going to kick in at an even higher rate. As bad as it is now, it's going to get much worse. Right now, Americans are really good at one thing. It's spending money. We are the #1 country in spending, and other countries make all the things that we buy. For now, they're happy to trade the goods that they produce for the green pieces of paper we give them. But if the US dollar was not the reserve currency, under a normal economy, we would have to produce things instead of just printing money that the rest of the world trades for their products. If and when the dollar loses its value, the rest of the world won't want dollars anymore. They will want stuff. They will demand products from us to trade with their products. And right now, we're not set up as a manufacturing economy. We don't have the factories. We don't have the savings to build factories. We don't have the skilled labor. We don't have the supply chains. We manufacture a little bit, but not enough to satisfy our demand. So what would happen if the dollar was no longer the world's reserve currency? American spending would implode and consumption would collapse because we'd have nothing to buy and our entire GDP would implode. We would have a massive recession because Americans wouldn't be buying anything because we couldn't afford anything, and all the shelves would be empty because foreign countries wouldn't be sending us the stuff they produce, and we don't have the capacity to produce it ourselves. Look, people aren't into lending money to lose it. they have to have a real return on their investment that exceeds the rate of inflation. And the reason that the Fed is not raising interest rates significantly to fight this inflation is because they can't do it because we all have so much debt. But the reason we have so much debt is because the Fed could never raise interest rates in the past, because every time they tried, the economy would go into recession. The markets would tank and they'd have to go right back to zero and do a bunch more of this quantitative easing. So the economy gets more and more addicted to cheap money every time, and we get a bigger dose. And now the Fed's trying to backtrack and flip and claim that we can just go cold turkey on the cheap money and nothing's going to happen. I mean, the economy has never been more vulnerable to an increase in interest rates than it is right now. But we've never had more inflation than we do right now. So higher interest rates have never been more necessary as they are right now, but we can't get them without collapsing the economy. So we won't get them, and we'll have massive inflation instead, which will do even more damage to the economy than the collapse would. Not only do they have to raise interest rates, they have to dramatically decrease the money supply and reverse this quantitative easing. Sadly, this is going to happen. The only question is, when will this happen? And the only way to avoid that would be for the US government to act fiscally responsible, but that's never going to happen. In fact, as long as the dollar is the current reserve currency, there's no incentive to be fiscally responsible. And that's the problem right there. We will keep on doing this until there is a crash, because the only thing that's going to stop it is a crash, because we won't voluntarily face the music because it's so politically damaging to the people in power to do that. A lot of people in the US, including the Fed, just take for granted the dollar's reserve currency status. They don't think that they could jeopardize that. No matter how much our deficits are, the rest of the world's just going to go along for the ride. And they think that because they've gone along so far. We've gotten away with this so far. The belief is that we're just going to get away with it indefinitely. And I think that hubris is going to have a big price, because they've underestimated the degree to which the reserve currency status is so integral to the entire bubble economy that we have, the entire service economy that we have. It's the linchpin. You pull that out and everything implodes. So there's not much we can do in the short term to avoid these problems. The problem with the economy is government and the Federal Reserve. We need a free market economy, not a government planned economy. In the long term, we must enable the economy to fix itself, dramatically reduce the size of government and its cost, so we can return the resources of our country to the private sector and deregulate the economy so that the free market can regulate it instead of a bunch of bureaucrats. We must return sound money standards and rethink federal taxes. People will still be helped the same as they were before, only instead of having someone else take your money and spend it on what they think you ought to spend it on, you will be in control because you know how best to spend your own money. And in this way, America can be a very prosperous nation again if we repeat what made us so rich in the first place. But right now we're broke and we just don't know it yet. We're living off borrowed money. We are the world's biggest debtor nation. We owe more money than all other nations combined. We're running enormous trade deficits with every nation on the face of the earth. So our economy is completely incapable of producing the goods that we consume. We borrow from the rest of the world because we don't have our own savings. We're basically being supported by the rest of the world. The world has to bear the cost of subsidizing the United States economy. And that has to come to an end if we're going to stand on our own 2 feet. If we're going to be productive again, then we have to return to limited government, maximum economic freedom type economy that we've had in the past. The US government and the Biden administration is going to have to dramatically reduce government spending, but that is looking more and more unlikely. The budget deficit is projected to be $2.5 to $3 trillion. But how are they going to sell $2.5 trillion worth of treasuries when the Federal Reserve is also selling hundreds of billions of treasuries in the same year? They can't do it. The federal government will have to dramatically cut spending so they don't have to borrow so much money. Or they have to have a massive tax hike on the middle class, like starting right now, effective immediately, like maybe double the income tax on the middle class, which they won't do. They're not going to cut spending either, because they'd have to cut Social Security, Medicare, all the entitlements, which they're actually just expanded. So we're broke. The Federal Reserve and all these ignorant politicians just voted to spend more money on these things that we can't even afford the money we're already spending. So it's never going to happen. They're just going to keep printing money until they destroy the value of the dollar completely. Prices are going to go through the roof, and they've only just started, and they're going to go even higher. This could end in hyperinflation, where the money becomes so worthless, and or an inflationary depression will occur. So we have to stop this from happening, and we have to suffer a financial crisis far greater than we've had to do before this. But this time there's going to be no bailouts, and so when investors are all lost and banks start to go under, people will lose their jobs and depositors will lose their money. The consequences of this is so horrible that they can't face it. They just have to keep kicking the can down the road, but that keeps making the impending consequences even worse. These taxes, regulations, and big government agencies have basically ruined American manufacturing, caused us to buy things overseas for cheaper and trade our jobs for cheaper stuff. And in the short term, it worked out, but we can't keep doing it anymore because we have so much debt, and wages have increased around the world, shortening that gap. Foreign countries don't want to play this game anymore, and we must experience the reality of the situation before our lifelines of credit are completely extinguished. Politicians are not the answer. It doesn't matter who you vote for. What you do need to do is protect yourself. And that's what I've been doing for years. And I've been encouraging all of my clients to do the same things. You've got to recognize that inflation is a tax. It's the way the government is funding its deficits. The deficits are going to go up, so the tax is going to go up. And there's more reasons now to avoid it. You need to own real productive assets of value, invest in companies that make things, resources, agriculture, mining, gold and silver, and of course, real estate.